project on government secrecy, and he then told AFP, quote, "What this study demonstrated is that the available intelligence shows that there was no attack. It's a dramatic reversal of the historical record. There were previous indications of this, but this is the first time we have seen the complete study," Aftergood said. Now, we were duped into this major war of my father's generation, and if this is news to you, many apologies from the mainstream media. We were also duped in the main wars of my generation. Everybody is familiar with Bush Jr.'s alleged WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, right? Problem: Saddam Hussein and the country of Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Reaction: this somehow threatens us, and what if the smoking gun comes in the form of... Solution: mission accomplished! But even if one did feel that situation warranted the preemptive invasion of another country, we would surely not be in this situation had our government not supported Saddam Hussein for at least a decade prior to our wars there. This was a repeat of a decade earlier with Bush Sr. It often surprises me how a president or administration can be simultaneously widely known for lying, while also being believed on other critical and related issues. The administration successfully silenced dissenters in its own agencies and manipulated all the intelligence to make their case on weapons of mass destruction to the United Nations. But after we found out about these lies, we continued to believe much of the intelligence passed down to us. What kind of crazed conspiracy theory is 19 hijackers from caves defeating one of the most robust and expensive military-industrial complexes on the planet 4 times in one day? In the week following the attacks, the BBC and some other respectable news agencies reported that several of those alleged hijackers were still alive and had been in the Middle East at the time of the attacks. Though 5 years later, the BBC explained that this was an error, case of mistaken identity. But whichever side of this aspect of the story is correct, the Federal Bureau of Investigation to this day has never listed the atrocities of 9/11 on their most wanted poster for Osama bin Laden. This is because there is simply not enough evidence to accuse him of these crimes in a court of law, let alone to start wars with sovereign nations. But why is this so hard for us to understand and accept? That rogue elements within our own government were capable of pulling off the attacks of 9/11. You might have been scared away from information about 9/11 conspiracy theories because some presentations try to inject religion or race, which has helped divide and conquer the 9/11 truth movement more in the past. Personally, I think if there is any single group responsible for these attacks, it is more likely they only share a geopolitical philosophy or life strategy attitude, not a specific religious sect. But more importantly, we do not yet have enough information to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the suspects on our list are guilty. Hence, the 9/11 truth movement generally fights for a new investigation and to end these truly Orwellian wars. Let me briefly explain why I started researching 9/11. That day I was baffled and offended at the instant war drumbeat and the quick certainty in targeting the enemy, Osama bin Laden, within minutes. It smelled fishy from the start, but in the coming years there were major problems with the official story which forced me to keep researching this. Physics, my personal favorite of the hard sciences. In New York that day, 2 planes hit 2 buildings, and 3 buildings collapsed. Yes, 3 buildings collapsed that day. Have you heard of World Trade Center 7, the 3rd building which collapsed later that day on 9/11? If not, please Google WTC 7 after this episode. All 3 of these buildings collapsed at nearly free fall speed in 10 to 15 seconds into their respective footprints. This means that the tops of the World Trade Center buildings fell nearly as fast as they would have if only air was beneath them, or a vacuum. But in a world where the basic laws of physics apply, quantum physics miracles aside, all of that steel and concrete below the tops of those buildings should have offered tons of resistance. I finally brought this simple science experiment to perform for people at this month's street action on the 11th in San Francisco. According to all video and seismic records, the tops of the buildings in fact managed to fall through the path of most resistance, through the entire building below, instead of falling off to the sides of the buildings, which would have offered no resistance. Furthermore, if Al-Qaeda really wanted to inflict maximum damage and death on the people of New York City, it would have been infinitely easier to make the building topple over to the side rather than imploding it completely into its own footprint. It takes a highly scientific controlled demolition team, usually days, to set up for a collapse of a building that large, specifically so they can make it fall into its own footprint. So according to the 9/11 Commission report, it seems like controlled demolition companies should just be thinking about using airplanes in the future to collapse buildings into their own footprint, instead of wasting all this time planning. World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 3 were also the first 3 and the last 3 large steel buildings to collapse from fire and damage in history. Now, despite my loving physics for most of my life, I majored in computer science with a minor in mathematics, and you shouldn't take my word alone for anything. So here's Stephen Jones.
My name is Dr. Stephen Jones. I have a PhD in physics from Vanderbilt University, 1978. I have a Bachelor of Science degree from Brigham Young University, 1973. I graduated magna cum laude. I went after PhD work. I did postdoctoral work at Los Alamos Maison Physics Facility. In June 2007, I was examining a dust sample, which I'd obtained from Jeanette McKinley. I was using a loupe and also just looking at it with my eyes and an ordinary optical microscope, although stereo, so that I could see better in 3 dimensions. And what I found was a chip that looked like it might be a paint chip. I mean, early on I was thinking, maybe not too interesting. But this chip was rather striking in its appearance. It had an orange-red color, first of all. And then I found several of these, and they all had some gray material adhering to the side of the red material. So layered. Later we found multiple layers, but most of these chips have 2 layers, red, gray. I did take one of these chips then to the electron microscope, the scanning electron microscope, and we looked at it with the electron microscope, and then we used a system where we could determine the elements. What we found in the red material is a combination of aluminum and iron oxide, and these are the components of thermite. Of course, now we looked with an electron microscope, we looked deeper and deeper, a higher and higher magnification. And I pulled in a colleague of mine, Dr. Jeffrey Ferrer. He's an expert on the electron microscope machine. So he actually broke a piece off of one of these red chips, and then later he did 4 different samples, broke a piece off. That gives you a fresh surface. Because in the dust, there's all sorts of stuff. There's zinc and titanium and calcium, all sorts of stuff. So he broke off a tip, you see, so we could look at a fresh surface. And then what you see in all 4 samples that we studied in this detail: carbon, which is significant, oxygen, iron, and aluminum. We looked at this, and these again are the ingredients, except for the carbon. And we found that experimenters working with superthermite, trying to beef it up, make it more explosive, tailoring it to different weapons applications, they would have silicon in there and an organic material, which means a carbon. So a polymer such as Viton, they would add to this to give it the properties they wanted. So that fit. Now, see, that was surprising to me to see silicon and carbon, but then we find in the literature that's what these guys are doing in the weapons labs, Livermore and Los Alamos. They're adding organic, because that gives you a gas production. When the thermite goes off, now you also have gas production, which gives you the explosive force for instance. I suggest